Okay, we are ready to go. Let me just check up on Rockfin real quick to hit the start button on Rockfin and we'll get underway. I hope everyone is doing well today. This is our first live of 2023,
Mm.
going live
Oh,
on Rockfin as well. And we are honored to have with us Mr. Larry Johnson of sonar21.com, an absolutely must read website. Go to it daily and you will get the best information as to what is going on in
mm,
the world.
mm,
So
mm,
let's let's begin. Let's begin. Let's say hello to everybody who is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on Rumble, on Locals, theduran.com. Hello to our Locals chat, and of course on YouTube. Hello to our moderators as well. We have with us Valies, William Justice, Reckless Abandon, and who else is moderating today? And myself.
mm,
Great team of moderators. Thank you very
mm.
much to everyone that helps to moderate the chat. It is good to have you with us. We have Alexander Mercouris, who is sitting in a very dark room
Mm.
somewhere in London. Let's
London.
begin. Alexander, Larry, let's talk about a command upgrade. I don't know if upgrade is a proper word,
Mm,
but
mm,
I kind of put that in there. We have
mm,
salt mines, of which I think Larry has written the best piece
mm,
on the salt mines of Solidar and
mm,
Bakhmut. So I pass it off to you, Alexander, and to Larry. Let's get
mm,
the show rolling.
mm. Well, absolutely, and it's a huge privilege to have Larry again, and we're delighted to have you, Larry. Can I just say I'm delighted, and can I just say welcome to our first live stream of
Yeah,
2023. And
wonderful.
also, I mean, I also want to endorse and add to what Alex said about uh, your website, Sonar 21. I mean, it's absolutely essential reading for anybody who wants a good explanation of what's going on, and wants also to understand and see the arguments that you can have with people, and the demolition, the deconstruction of the narratives that we sometimes have to put up with. Well, I'm going to say this. It's a very important moment, I think, in the conflict now, because we've had this long cascade of talk going all the way back to August about Ukraine winning. We've had the offensive in Kharkov. We've had the offensive in Kherson. Suddenly, over the last week or so, there's been a realization that things are not going well. And this is all crystallized now with these battles that are happening in Solidar, um, Bakhmut, and all of the rest. Suddenly, there's a sense of things not going very well. And you can get a feel, in my opinion, for the fact that there is this sense of doubt starting to take hold, at least in London, from the stories that the media here are pushing. One is a story about, well, the changes in the high command in Russia. This was yesterday, by the way, the big media story. And you have the Financial Times publishing an article on this very thing, saying that Surovikin, the previous commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine, has just been demoted because of his military failures. This on the same day that the Russians have won their great battle in Solidar. And an even stronger sense, in my opinion, of how desperate things are becoming is that for the first time today, the British media has started to switch to another story, which is Biden and the classified documents, something which up to this moment they had completely ignored. It's suddenly become newsworthy. So let's talk about the events in Ukraine. Let's talk about this battle, first of all, but let's also talk about this change, this reshuffle in the command system. And Larry, you wrote a piece about this yesterday, with which I'm in complete agreement. Perhaps you can start there. Tell us what you think
Sure.
is coming.
Well, I don't believe in coincidence. So that that I'm very doubtful of the explanations that people wake up in the morning and go, man, what am I going to do? You know what? I'm going to replace Surovikin today. I think he's doing a crappy job. No, this comes with a plan. And when you read the announcement, the fact that Surovikin is the deputy, but his focus is on the aerospace forces, and that's sort of his specialty. And so when I saw that, I went, oh boy, because they're freeing him up where he doesn't have to worry about ground operations as well and maritime operations, that he's going to be exclusively focused now on the aerospace. And up to this point, the Russian Air Force has not played a significant role in the special military operation. I mean, they've been active and they've been shooting down some other combat aircraft, but they haven't been doing intensive aerial bombardments. They have launched some missiles. So there is a lot of room for that aerospace operation to increase. And the fact that Gerasimov is being put now as commander of the joint force, and that joint force notion, I think, is very important because it doesn't imply just a one-trick pony. And then when you add, you've got all these command changes taking place on the very day that Soledar is confirmed to be captured, and which really represents a significant disruption in the defensive line that Ukraine had. But on that very same day, then you get a major sortie from another port in the Black Sea of Russian ships and submarines, largest yet. Basically, empty the port with a heavy landing ship. And then, same time, you're getting reports up north of the joint military exercises between Russia and Belarus, shipments of massive numbers of tanks, vehicles, artillery pieces, and then on top of that, you also have air operations up there. So I just put myself, if I'm sitting there in the Ukrainian general staff, trying to figure out what the Russians are up to, I would probably want to have some adult depends on, because what's coming down the pike, you don't know where you're going to get hit from. But the Russians are moving on multiple fronts, and they have a whole lot of options in front of them. And what makes today different from, say, World War II or even the Civil War is that back then we got instant information about troop locations, about movements. So today it is much more difficult to create a surprise and to sneak a large unit of troops from one position to another. So I think yesterday really marked a watershed in this special military operation. It's going to move to a new level now.
I completely agree. Can I just make a few quick observations about this? I think Surovikin was brought in September at the time when the Russians decided to announce this mobilization. And I think he was brought in for one specific purpose, which he's discussed many times. He gave an interview. He said he was going to fortify the lines, build up a strategic reserve, and grind the Ukrainians down. That was his job. Now he's fortified the lines. We're getting pictures all over the place of these huge fortifications that have been built in precisely the locations where there's been talk about the Ukrainians launching offensives. He's steadily presided over the integration of the new reservists into the military, and we've been hearing a great deal about this build-up of this reserve force. Putin says it's about 160,000 men, which is a lot of people. And on top of that, he's been grinding the Ukrainians down. He's grinding them down in Bakhmut and Soledar. He's been grinding them down with his missile strikes. Now, there's a very interesting piece which I read somewhere very recently. I think it was, in fact, believe it or not, in Foreign Policy, which said that one of the points about these missile campaigns was twofold. Firstly, obviously, degrade the Ukrainian electricity system, all that we have been hearing about. But the other is exhaust and grind down Ukraine's air defense system. Find out where all the missile launchers are. Deplete Ukraine's stock of missiles. And then, of course, you can send your bombers in, which is, of course, what Surovikin's ultimate responsibility is. He was always the chief of the aerospace forces. And then it's been explained to me, I'm not an expert in these things, that if you're talking about Ukrainian defenses, the most effective way to break defenses is to bomb them from the air, not launch artillery, but big bombs from the air. So that seems to me where we are. And it is exactly consistent with what you've just said. And I'm going to add one further and last point, which is, of course, Gerasimov is the senior military officer in Russia. He's the chief of the general staff. We have a huge military now being deployed in multiple locations all over, the front lines and in Belarus as well. And you need somebody who's able to coordinate that. You need somebody who's able to deal with supply issues, the ammunition issues, the deployment issues, who's able to coordinate a front lines on multiple vectors. And who better to do that than the person who's been doing it already as part of his job, who is the chief of the general staff. So I agree with you. I think this is the most ominous development if you're a Ukrainian. And if you're in the West, it shows that the Russians are moving from a defensive position, which they basically maintained for the last few months, towards an offensive one. Where the blow will fall, when exactly, that's another issue. I'm not in a position to say. But I think overall your assessment is spot on.
Yeah, one of the things I find very fascinating about Russia's current comportment. Under the Soviet Union, there was a lot of insecurity. And if you've ever been around an insecure person, the insecure person tends to brag about themselves and I'm so great. And, they try to compensate for their inadequacies. This current group of Russians, man, they're dead silent. They are not a self-promoting lot. They keep it quiet. They're keeping their cards, as they say, close to the vest. They don't feel the need to go out and play a propaganda game with the West to say, I'm good too. And that is why I think it's a historical change, because it really is a complete break with the old Cold War mentality. And Russia has finally sort of awakened and realized these guys are a bunch of clowns. I can compete with them. I mean, it's sort of like the feeling I had one time I was on CNN debating Alan Dershowitz. And, he's Harvard, this and that, and I'm not. And I whooped him. So, I think Russia's coming into a reality now that they recognize their very existence is a threat, that the West is not kidding about that they have lied, that the West has deceived at every turn. They've not been serious about arms control. They've not been serious about peace treaties. And, I think it took, even Putin sort of acknowledged it, I think, in his recent speech in the last couple of weeks. That, in the past, we basically trusted them, and we're not going to make that mistake again.
I completely agree. Again, I mean, this, of course, brings up the question whether any negotiations now between the West and the Russians are a practical issue. And I have to say this, I don't think people in the West are aware of this. I think always in the West it's framed about whether we should negotiate with the Russians or not. Is it proper, ethical? Does it make sense for us to sit down and talk with the Russians? I've never seen anyone even cross their mind in any commentary piece that perhaps the problem is that the Russians are not going to be very interested in talking to us, because we have, as you correctly said, damn it, we repeatedly made promises which we haven't kept. And I mean, it's become an almost morbid thing, actually, the extent to which we make promises which we don't keep. And I do wonder, actually, whether, when the final penny drops, that, we might find ourselves in a situation where the Russians decide things and make their decisions and arrange things for themselves. And, we come along and we say, well, let's talk, let's sit down, let's find compromises. What is going to happen when the Russians say no? We're not interested. Go away. We're going to just decide this for ourselves. I don't think a lot of people in the West have understood this, but I think we're very, very close to that point as well. And I think this point about the Russians behaving with a degree of self-confidence, which I've never seen, I think that is also correct as well in every particular.
Yeah, it is. They have so many resources, and they have such a rich cultural heritage. And then, in contrast to that, everything that's been, at least in America, in the United States here, over the last, now let's call it 7 years, started in 2015. This anti-Russian craziness, and then to tar Donald Trump and to insist that Russia was meddling in U.S. elections, and the CIA and the FBI were the biggest meddlers, and all the time demonizing Russia. And even when Trump took power, it put Trump in a position where he could not actually have a legitimate negotiation with Russia on anything. And creating that kind of separation when you're dealing with a nuclear power, but not just a nuclear power with a full industrial base that frankly nobody in the West has. There is no country in the West that can compete with what Russia is doing now from an industrial standpoint. And when you say that, people look at you like you're crazy, but it is a fact. And as I noted in one of my recent pieces, I did get a big laugh out of, on the one hand, they're talking about Russia being a backward place technologically, and yet it is Russian rockets and spacecraft which carry Western astronauts to the International Space Station. And on that very day, England tried to launch its satellite from air, and it blew up, didn't work, collapsed. So, at some point, you got to look in the mirror and just recognize that, maybe some humility on the West might be appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, that humiliation for Britain, something, of course, that the Russians have been doing, launching satellites since 1957. We started doing it, and we can't do it. And of course, we're the technologically advanced people, and they are not. But anyway, I'm going to say one thing, which is about this last year that has passed, 2022, which is, I think, there's a fundamental difference in perception about 2022 and about the way the conflict played out between the way it's been seen in the West or reported in the West and the way it was seen and reported in Russia. In the West, we have been very focused, very understandably, on the military things. And we were talking all the time about, battles here, advances here, advances there. That's been the major topic of discussion. In Russia, of course, it was different. It was economics. And this is something that people don't quite understand, because they felt themselves in February, March, to be under this massive sanctions attack. And I was following news from Russia at that time. There was a huge amount of stress and nervousness in Russia at that time. Would the economy hold? Would it collapse? Would there be another economic implosion? And at the level of the government, at the level of the political leadership, what is the popular reaction going to be now that we find ourselves in a conflict like this? And I think what has astonished the Russians themselves, because they have been listening to all the things that people are saying about them in the West, is firstly how well their economy has held up. And this has been something that Putin was just talking about today. And that has given them enormous sense of reassurance and confidence that they can see this thing through. And the other thing is the extent to which popular support for this war has been strong and has held solid. And that, I think, for the Russians has been the biggest story of 2022. They had to make sure that the home front was strong before they worried, if you like, too much about what was going on the battlefields.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to remember the time when the people of Russia longed for blue jeans from the West. That it was both a fashion statement and it was a sense of, dealing again with their insecurity. Well, now I think the blue jean generation is over because that, as you've correctly noted, over this last year, Russia has come to realize we can operate a fully functioning economy without having Starbucks and McDonald's and any of the other Western businesses that flock to Russia. Russia's leverage has been limited because they're not a large market. They're not 600, 800 million people. But the fact that they're still large enough and they are self-contained, and then in the process, this creation of a new world order. That's the only way I can describe it. Because the post-World War II order with the creation of the International Monetary Fund, even the United Nations, in the World Bank, and the petrodollar, that's in the process of collapsing or becoming irrelevant. And Russia is smartly forging alliances, not just with China, but with India, with Brazil, with other countries to show that there is a world outside of what has been the traditional Western dominance. And the West, this war in Ukraine highlights the difference in thinking. I think the Russians understand that the conflicts on the battlefield is just one element of this war. It is not the war. It is one element. It has to be, there's also the political and economic dimensions of it. The West doesn't understand that.
No,
the West
it doesn't.
Yeah, they're like a 3-year-old child with a hammer. Everything looks like a nail.
This is absolutely correct. I mean, this is very much, by the way, the Russian mindset, and it goes back long before, the Soviet Union came along. That for the Russians, war is an all-encompassing thing. When you're in one, every instrument of policy has to be applied to making it happen, including diplomacy, which the Russians do, and we don't. Now, Larry, you've been involved in, well, kind of diplomatic activities. You were there in the 1980s, I believe. You saw
Yes.
how the United States used to run diplomacy in those days. Would you agree with me that our diplomatic services in the West have effectively collapsed? We don't seem to know how to conduct diplomacy anymore. I hear all sorts of extraordinary stories about the sort of coarse language and bullying that passes for the kind of things that Western, not just American, but Western diplomats now engage in. Is there any understanding of the goodwill that loses?
No, I mean, you're right with, I think back to, so I was in State Department when James Baker was around. And regardless of whether you agree with Baker's policies, he was a sophisticated man who knew how to deal appropriately with other world leaders and to not just mistreat people. He understood that you may have to live with these people next week or the week after. And remember, it was Baker that gave assurances to Gorbachev that NATO was not going to expand further to the east. And then since Bill Clinton, and it continued under Clinton and to George W. Bush and then Obama, we've seen a real dramatic deterioration in the quality and maturity of our diplomats. They've become really beholden to pleasing the masters, not wanting to offend the higher ups, as opposed to really being able to speak out and speak candidly and frankly about something that, well, I mean, in the case of Ukraine, this entire notion that Russia invaded Ukraine out of the blue for no reason whatsoever, the fact that that's actually repeated and accepted as a truth by senior diplomats just highlights the problem.
What about intelligence, which is, of course, the other area where you had massive experience, if I can say that? I mean, again, I remember in the 1970s, my memory goes back then to then, and the 1980s. I remember every so often you used to get CIA fact books and all kinds of things. And sometimes they got it wrong. I mean, they did sometimes get it wrong. I seem to remember at one time they said in the 70s that the Soviet Union was going to become an oil importer, for example. It never happened. But overall, there was a lot of very high quality things. And you always got the impression that the government, the US government, the White House, Congress were being advised professionally. You might again not always agree with what was being provided. You might get your own views about it, but it was a professional operation carried out with enormous resources and with a real sense of responsibility to keep the United States government properly informed about what it was doing. Maybe I'm being idealizing the past, but
Yeah.
compared to what we have now, I don't think you can perhaps deny that there's some force in a point that, there's been a plunge in the quality of intelligence too.
Yeah, well, there's always been political pressure. And what do I mean by political pressure? Go back into the Vietnam War, where Lyndon Johnson and McNamara over the Defense Department and McGeorge Glenn, National Security Advisor, were calling up the CIA branch division chief who was responsible for the analysis in Vietnam, pressuring him. His name was George Allen, and pressuring George Allen to change their assessment, to be a team player. So that pressure's always been there. The difference was George Allen at least resisted that pressure for a while. He did succumb to it, and he fought back. I saw it in my stint at the CIA. I started in 1985, and I was right in the middle of the Contra War. I was the Honduran analyst, and then later the senior regional analyst for Central America. And I saw pressure brought to bear on me to try to shade or alter what we were saying. Still had support up the chain of command to write what we were seeing. In other words, for example, that the Central Americans were enthusiastic of the US policy, despite what Washington, D.C. was saying. So you've got to have the freedom to do that. But that's now disappeared at CIA. What has happened is they brought analysts and operations folks together. And when you're in operations, they're planning support for Ukraine, they're planning propaganda campaigns or messages to get out and doing it and how to use social media. And so can you imagine an analyst standing up in the midst of say the morning meeting, staff meetings, and saying, we have to acknowledge that the role that the West had in provoking the Russians in this. Yeah, you're not allowed to say that. And but it goes deeper than that. I just had a conversation with a friend who's an intelligence officer, and was asking me, I said, really, where are you getting your casualty numbers from? And he said, what the Defense Intelligence Agency is doing is they're taking what Ukraine tells them and repeating that. Now you go, wait a second. As an intelligence analyst, ideally, you have at least 6 categories of different kinds of intelligence you can use to try to triangulate or confirm, corroborate one source of information. Now, one of those sources of intelligence information is what is called liaison reporting. A foreign intelligence organization will pass information to you. That is what the CIA is relying on almost entirely now these days. That's the problem.
Absolutely. Can I just ask a particular question? Because what you've told me about the effective merger of people from operations and people from analysis is really quite startling and disturbing. I can remember in the 1970s that people were always talking about the fact that the real greatness, the real skill in the US, in US intelligence, was precisely that there was this division between the spies and the analysts. We even had a word for them. I don't know whether this is just something that we in the media used to say, but we used to say the eggheads and the spooks. That the United States kept a division between the two, which was not typical of other intelligence agencies, not typical so much of the Russians, for example. And that this is the quality, so that there was always a tension within the intelligence community between these two people, groups of people, and that this was in fact something that played an important role in making sure that the US government, was kept not just informed about things, but was also provided with different opinions from different sources within the intelligence community about how to interpret the data that was provided, which is actually generally helpful. I mean, is that correct? That whole culture has disappeared?
Well, in fact, it used to be at the main CIA headquarters there in McLean, Virginia. They literally, if you're standing in front of the building looking at the main entrance, when you got up to the first, I think it was the third floor where you had the first continuous hallway across the front of the building, there were doors literally blocking the hallway, and they used to be locked. And then that was in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. That door, that was locked, so you couldn't, they kept the sides separate. Then in the late 70s, they opened the doors. And so by the time I was there in 85, I was an analyst, but I was in the career trainee program for the first year. And so I got to do an 8-week internship on the Afghan task force. And then that was followed by another 8-week internship on the Central American task force, where I worked with the DO. What I have heard from some of my friends who are case officers, and case officers are the operational personnel, they as well agreed that there needed to be that separation with the analysts, because they said the risk of getting too close to the sources and if you will, fall in love with the source and not being able to step back and be objective about it, because there are some genuine professional intelligence officers that at least were out there that recognize the need to keep that separation. John Brennan is the one who really brought this to the full, let's call it integration. And it's disastrous, because you cannot get honest, objective analysis out of it now, because it takes backseat to what the operational objectives and priorities are.
Very, very, very troubling indeed. Anyway, let's look at the whole situation in Ukraine and the West, because we have massively invested now in the West, in this affair, in this conflict in Ukraine. I mean, we are always looking, to whenever there's a problem, our response, certainly in Europe, I'm sure in the United States even more, is to send even more weapons there. So now we're talking about Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s and all of these things, which are not going to resolve the problems there, at least not in my opinion. What happens, and this is the question I always get asked, what happens when it becomes impossible to deny the reality of the debacle? To how far is the US leadership, because it ultimately depends on them, how far will it go?
Well, yeah, this takes us off into another direction, and I think Alex Cristoforo talked about it on his broadcast this morning, so I even listened to you in the morning. That news coming out about Joe Biden now about these classified documents. Well, wait a second. Where did that come from? There's a reason that's being leaked. That's not just that a boring news day and they had to have a story, and so they put that out. Because it would be easy to hide that fact if they wanted to. So somebody put it out, and I think it's part of the preparation that, at least in the United States, Joe Biden is going to get the full blame for the collapse and surrender of Ukraine, because that will come on the heels of the collapse and surrender in Afghanistan. And so I think it's being used personally as a means to force his exit. added to his other just senior moments and age-related issues. I think this really could lead to the final breakup of NATO. That people are going to say, what's the use of having this organization anyway, when we have now exposed its weakness, because it does not have a reservoir of troops. Or let's put it this way: the biggest troop concentration in NATO, I believe, after the United States, is Turkey. So, and what's going on with Turkey? Oh, you got guys like John Bolton saying we got to toss Turkey out. Turkey we're reaching some accommodations with Russia that the West is not happy with, but Turkey lives in that neighborhood, and they're not stupid. They recognize it's better to have good relations with Russia. So I see this as the reality is going to set in. They don't have a standardized weapons package. They don't have an industrial base to produce and supply. This is industrial war, and I know that Andrei Martyanov did a recent broadcast on that, where when you go through it and look at, you've got to have steel, you've got to have the ability to produce both the artillery shells and the cruise missiles and the tanks across the board. And if you don't have that, then you're not in a position to fight any kind of sustained combat, which Russia, in 2022, demonstrated nothing else. Russia showed its ability to sustain operations at a high level without suffering shortages. And by the same token, the West exposed itself as unable to sustain high operations.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm just going to add something else. We've had the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain talking. I think it was earlier today. I mean, I didn't listen to it, but I've heard reports about this. And he's talking about the fact that Ukraine needs thousands of tanks. Now, I've looked at how many tanks there are, Leopard 2 tanks, because that's the one that everybody's talking about. Well, there's about 1,500 of them. I mean, there are just not the thousands of tanks that he might be thinking about. The United States, as it happens, does have thousands of tanks. I mean, the United States does have a significant tank force, but the rest of NATO just does not. And it is absurd to imagine that it can supply thousands of tanks to Ukraine. And we certainly do not have the industrial, organizational means in order to produce weapons in Europe on that kind of scale. Just a few months ago, the German government was talking wildly about how they were going to massively increase military production, arms production in Germany. And they've had to basically abandon all those ideas because the German industrial system, which is perhaps the most developed industrial system in Europe, simply can't do it. It's simply not an option anymore. So they've had to actually row back on all those plans because the plans are simply not workable. Now, I think in the United States, you probably, at horrific cost, could increase production of some things even more. But I'm going to make a guess, even there, it would be incredibly challenging to do. And I don't think that this is really something that American society would accept at this time, given that there's so many other problems building up, not just in the United States, but right across all the Western economies.
But it's not just the actual the lack of steel plants. That is a problem. The plant infrastructure that existed during and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, where the United States became was an industrial behemoth, that's gone. But there's also, let's call it, the technological sophistication. The United States takes great pride in saying, "Oh yeah, we're the best. We're the most sophisticated and technologically advanced." Yet the United States still is unable to produce a hypersonic missile. I mean, I've spoken directly with one of the people involved with the development of it, and says that it probably will have it by the end of 2023. Russia's producing them and using them. They're field tested. So you got to step back and say, well, wait a second. And the same we've seen with the artillery shells. They make fun of Russia going to Iran to buy some drones, but the United States goes hat in hand begging South Korea to come up with some artillery shells that we can buy. We sold them to South Korea. We'll buy them back at a premium and then send them to Ukraine, because we do not have the armament factories to produce it. So, at some point, you've got to sit there and step back and say, we're spending $850 billion on the U.S. defense industry, and yet we can't turn out enough artillery shells to sustain Ukraine's rate of fire for 1 week. What's wrong with this picture?
To say straight away, this has been my biggest shock of 2022. I mean, again, I'm somebody who was brought up, with the legend, if you like, of the United States and the Second World War. I mean, obviously, I knew that it wasn't on that scale quite like that anymore. I think that things have changed, but that the United States would struggle to produce weapon systems, just ordinary, simple, basic weapons, on the kind of scale that was needed. I mean, that is something that I never imagined. I mean, that I think even the Russians, by the way, have been astonished by. And I've heard other things to add to that one of the fundamental problems now in cranking up industrial production, apart from lack of steel plants, lack of factory space, lots of things like that, is lack of skilled workers.
Yes.
And I mean, even making artillery shells requires work, which may sound like a simple thing. It's not that simple. I mean, it's you do require people with certain levels of skills. In the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, the depths of industrial and technical know-how in the United States amongst the general US population was colossal. It apparently isn't like that anymore. And that, I have to say, amazes me. It's the same in Britain, by the way.
Yeah, no, it's there's a TV personality over here on Fox News called Jesse Waters, and he does the typical man on the street interviews. And he had his correspondent out the other day and stopping people and ask him, what is 100 divided by 5? And they were stumped. We're talking adults in their 20s, some in their early 30s, and they got this blank deer in the headlight look. And some are going, 50? So it was a illustration of your basic point. The U.S. educational system, and compare it to what went on in Russia, and again referencing Andrei Martyanov's books, particularly his book Losing Military Supremacy, as he compares the college aptitude test that you must take in the United States with the college aptitude test you take in Russia. And in the United States, you get multiple choice, where at least you have a 25% chance of guessing the right answer. And Russia's blind. You gotta know the answer. Either you know it or you don't. And that level of difference, I think, comes to play when we see it on the battlefield. A lot of people in the West, particularly the United States, have no understanding or memory at all of what the Soviets did in World War II. And they fought the bulk of the largest battles, land battles in that war of any compared to the United States and Great Britain, the vast majority. And they did so with some incredible military planning. And they didn't have computers and they didn't have PowerPoint. But they were able to defeat the Germans and defeat them decisively in ways that nobody thought possible. I can't believe that legacy has been lost within the current Russian leadership. Because every May when they have the parade, the May parade commemorating the dead that have died, it's just it shows you they remember. They have not forgotten. Whereas you don't see similar celebrations or commemorations here in the West anymore. Well, choosing.
Do American leaders know this? Do they understand the extent to which the former, the things that made America powerful before, militarily powerful,
No.
a lot of that has atrophied? I mean, are they aware of the extent to which this is the case? And because I get the impression that they don't, that they still believe that if they press the right buttons, that somehow everything else will bend to their will in some way.
Yeah, well, even when you have Donald Trump saying, "Oh, the American military is the greatest in the world," no, it's not. No, it's not. Okay, we've got. If you're chalking up Afghanistan, the results of Afghanistan and Iraq as examples of U.S. military prowess, forget about it. It's just, and there is no self-reflection or honesty among the American politicians, that they don't want to recognize the limitations now that the United States faces. Because let's just say that the United States says, okay, we're going to get involved in the war with Russia. What are we going to do? We don't have 500,000 trained military personnel that we can rapidly mobilize and ship over to Poland in a week. If we tried to do something like that, we'd be looking at least a year. So you've got a long window that's, and the bureaucratic term for it is tip film. So time, phase, flow of troop deployment. It's a long acronym. So you've got that, and then in tandem with that, you've got the breakdown of a lot of the aircraft. You've had a reduction in the number of ships that would be used to transport. So this is not Star Trek where we have that magic transporter that we could just, beam up and beam down, Scotty. So we don't have the ability to project troop force over there in any size, much less once they're deployed, the logistics train required to sustain them in the field with not just ammunition and artillery shells, but with food and medical care. We were stretched in Iraq, for heaven's sake. And, Iraq was a third-rate military with no air power. So we can't do it on the ground. And going into the air, thanks to George W. Bush, the Russians have the best anti-ballistic missile and air defense system in the world. And the United States doesn't. So when you've got to sit back and look at this, and it's ridiculous. No, very, very, very few of the politicians are willing to sit down and have an honest discussion about it. And I think it's only going to be able to have that discussion once the United States loses in a big way in a conflict.
Yeah. Can I just say, an article that you did recently, in which you can find on Sona 21, you discussed this piece by Condoleezza Rice and Bill Gates. Not Bill Gates, whatever his name is. Robert Gates. I'm so sorry, Freudian slip there. But anyway, there it was. But again, these were people who have served in the US government. She was Secretary of State, he was Secretary of Defense. I believe, I may be wrong here, but I believe he has a background in intelligence as well.
Oh, he was the Deputy Director of Intelligence I'll tell you a story about him in a second.
Well, there you go. But they did this thing. They said, we got to give Ukraine all that it needs, all the resources that it needs. There was no, the thing that struck me about that article, again, is that there was no understanding, as far as I could see, that there is a finite level of resources. There's a finite total level of resources, but there is a finite total level of resources that you can properly expend on a conflict like Ukraine's. It's as if you can do anything. You can do exactly, what you said, Star Trek. You just press the button and, you can produce anything you want in any quantity that you want. And I have to say, this really did seem amazing to me, and so different, again, from American leaders that I remember in my lifetime. I mean, I remember McNamara. I mean, I remember him after in Vietnam, because I mean, I don't remember him when he was in Vietnam. I don't stretch that far. But certainly, I mean, he was a person who'd worked for, I think it was the Ford Motor Company or General Motors Motor Company. But he did understand industrial processes. He had many bad ideas about them, in my opinion, but at least he understood that there was a limit beyond which you can't do things. And I didn't get any sense of that from reading this article by Gates and Rice. I mean, that was what I mean. That and I have to say I was shocked by this, but I find this there all the time.
Yeah, well, the fact that both of them are considered within American circles as Russian experts. So Gates, Condoleezza Rice got expertise in academia. Gates was he actually worked for Ray McGovern out at SCAG. He was a junior analyst at McGovern. I always blame Ray. He should have given him bad performance reviews and kept him out. When Gates was the director of intelligence, so he was the director of intelligence overseeing the analysts when I was there. And we had a South African analyst who, ironically enough, was named John Reed. And John Reed was asked to write a piece about, the question was, is Nelson Mandela a communist? And Reed wrote basically was, Nelson Mandela's, while having these associations and affiliations with these groups that have links to the Soviets, is not a communist. And Gates just took out one word. Can you guess what that word might have been? Not. So Gates was going to test the intelligence, overrule the analysts in order to give the White House the kind of answer it wanted. That's the kind of guy he is. So in that sense, I'm not at all surprised that he and Condi would write, direct like this. That they're smart enough to recognize the writings on the wall. Ukraine is losing, and there's no magic elixir, no Wunderwaffe, no wonder weapon that's going to turn the tide. And yet, what did they end up calling for? Send more weapons. It's like, you got to be careful. Send them to who? And when you send them, how are you going to fix them? Do you have enough spare parts to send along with them? And how about training the people to use them? I mean, there's a whole level of information underneath that send weapons that has to be understood and implemented.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was a very bizarre article in The Guardian. I found it bizarre by, I can't remember the name of the man, Lewbridge, I think it was. I don't know who he is, anything about him, by the way. But anyway, about sending tanks to Ukraine. Ukraine needs tanks. And Ukraine needs lots of tanks, because without tanks, it can't conduct offensives. Well, that's perfectly true. But again, absent any awareness that Ukraine used to have lots of tanks. What happened to them? I mean, if you don't, ask yourself those sort of questions, then your analysis is already going to be flawed. And of course, you were talking about Western tanks. If we're going to talk about, the British Challenger 2 tank, now I'm told this is an outstanding tank. It can do amazing things. I also know that it weighs 75 tons. I mean, 75-ton behemoth sent to a place like Ukraine. I mean, the logistical complexity of keeping such a thing operating on the battlefield is just going to be horrific, and apparently uses a different type of gun from the ones that other NATO tanks use, and we're only going to supply 10 of them. Apparently, that's what we're talking about. I mean, this just cannot be serious. The people who are talking in this way just don't understand what they're talking about.
Yeah, well, when you look at the difference in, let's just compare a rifle, the AR-15, the old M16 that the United States deployed in Vietnam, with the Kalashnikov, the Russian-Soviet Kalashnikov, which continues to be produced and used around the world. The Kalashnikov is much simpler and endures and holds up and can be, it can shoot a wide variety of, it shoots the same caliber ammunition, but you can use steel, brass, it can handle it all. The M16, the AR platforms, they can be very finicky and very sensitive. And so it's like nobody thought about the fact, hey, you're going to be in combat. There's going to be violence. You're going to be diving into the dirt. You're going to be running into things. You're going to be hit. So you want something that can take a beating and keep on ticking. And that's where the entire orientation of Western defense production it's something they've ignored. It has been catering to political needs and to local, what will sell at home, what can you sell to Congress that they'll sign off on, as opposed to, does this actually make strategic sense for us? And the United States has just one disaster after another on that front. And I think, Russia, I have run into this mentality with not just Russia, but with other countries. When I taught a senior crisis management seminar for the State Department, these other countries would show up and they would think that the United States was lying to them, that we had some secret plan we weren't divulging, that we were playing some sort of three-dimensional chess and we weren't showing you the other two levels. And that, for example, was the question with respect to why did we invade Iraq in 2003? They figured that the United States had some global strategic vision and master plan. And I said, no, we're winging it, guys. And sorry to disappoint. And I think the Russians have finally come to recognize that the United States is not governed by any kind of strategic vision at all in its military doctrine and operations. And you just had one of the Secretary of the Navy the other day, just in the United States, just let the cat out of the bag. He said, if we keep supplying Ukraine for the next 6 months, we're not going to have anything left for the Navy in the Pacific. So,
yeah, I saw that, by the way, and I have to say, it's not just the Russians who've seen this, and that's bad enough. The Chinese, if you go to their media, they're picking up on this. They're picking up on this as well. They have gradually come to understand two things, and I'm afraid this is very disturbing. One is that anything that President Biden tells them can't be trusted. That as Xi Jinping said to Biden, I've said this many times, it is disastrous, but he said it, and the Chinese published a readout about it. He says, you tell me one thing about Taiwan, and then your administration goes and does the diametric opposite. In other words, he's told Biden, you're lying to me. Now, you may take any view you wish about Taiwan, but you can't have a situation where the president of the United States is telling another world leader, like the Chinese leader, something which isn't straightforward and ultimately true. If you do that, trust collapses. If you say straightforwardly, we are going to support Taiwan to do this, then that's a clear position. But duplicity is the worst mistake you can make in diplomacy. There are textbooks about this, stretching all the way back to the first textbooks about diplomacy way back in the 18th century. So the Chinese have understood that, and they've understood something else. And it's exactly the point that you just made, that the United States, in spite of all the claims, does not have a grand strategy, not a real one. They've got all kinds of fantastic schemes: fragment Russia, decolonize it, do this, do that. But none of these are grounded in any real plan. And there is no consensus anyway within the United States government behind any of them, because they're never discussed or thought through properly.
Yeah, well, look, China, for example. What's the United States going to do to China? We don't have a well-trained swim team that can attack them. Landing Marines on their shores, that's not a viable option. If we get our aircraft carrier task force within 500 miles of their coast, they have hypersonic missiles. they'll sink them. The Chinese will sink them. So the United States has now painted itself into a corner where its only military option is using nuclear weapons. It has nothing else. It has no way, because the United States is inherently an expeditionary military force, and the numbers have been cut in terms of the troop strength, but we don't have the ability, the actual infrastructure required to support moving that force overseas. So it's, the first problem is you can't get them there, and then once you get them there, what are you going to do with them? Because both China and Russia enjoy the advantage that they're fighting to defend home territory. So, the United States has been lost in this haze since World War II, that because we convinced ourselves that we went to Europe and we beat the Germans, we don't tell the other part of the story of what the critical role the Soviets played, that therefore we can keep doing that. And yet, you go back, Korea War, Vietnam War didn't work out well. We can beat up on Panama. Okay, we did okay there. But Iraq, Afghanistan. So at some point, America's got to step back and say, wait a second. This is the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome, and we don't get it.
What you tell me, Larry, always in some ways at a fundamental level distresses me, because I am somebody who has been for most of his life so intensely pro-American. Even to this day, I mean, one of my favorite TV series, by the way, is The Untouchables. The one from the 1950s and 60s, Elliot Ness and all of that. And for me, that still remains, in some respects, the real United States. Elliot Ness, for me, still represents. He was a real person, by the way, and it turns out that he did actually do many of the things that are attributed to him. Anyway, for me, that is the real America. And one of the things that really, again, disturbed me, but I find it very, very interesting in one of your recent pieces, was that you said that when you went to Washington, DC for the first time, I think you said it was in 1979, a significant year in Britain, by the way. I mean, this is a relatively modest place. People, who had comfortable lifestyles, but they weren't. You didn't see. I think you said Ferraris and Lamborghinis all over the place. There weren't. There was only one mall where you could buy real luxuries, and now you go there, and it's, well. Tell us about what you see when you go there and what the effect of all of this is. And I can't help but think that it's all this money that's now slushing around all the time that is the source of all the trouble.
Yeah, it started really in the 90s too, under Clinton. And this is not to blame it. It's bipartisan, so it's not just Clinton. There's Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama. That's actually one of the reasons that Trump represented such a threat, because he was disrupting that system. But they started outsourcing analytical work at CIA to corporations like SAIC. So as an analyst, let's see, back when I was there, I was getting, let's say, $85,000 a year. But when it gets outsourced to one of these places like SAIC, I'd be getting paid $200,000. So what the U.S. government is doing is paying double and triple the money for work that used to be done in-house. Now, if you were a private corporation trying to make a profit, you would never get away with doing that. But because it's Uncle Sam and they keep rolling in the taxpayer dollars, and up to this point, been able to finance the U.S. budget with on the backs of other countries, they've gotten away with it. I mean, I love America, at least the concept of America. And as I've said before, I've got ancestors that fought in the American Revolution. But we're at a situation now in the United States where it's like you have a beloved family member that's addicted to drugs or alcohol. You need to have an intervention. And there needs to be an intervention for the United States to sit back and step back and say, sit down and rethink what it is you're doing. You can't continue to go this way. When you consider that the total U.S. defense budget is $850 billion for this fiscal year, and that we've spent over $120 billion in Ukraine in 10 months, 11 months. It doesn't compute, and there are only a few on this side of the pond that are, raising some real concerns about it. But none of them are in positions of real influence, and the political leaders continue to double down. That's why, I keep using that Saturday Night Live skit, "More Cowbell," because we just keep pouring it on without thinking about the consequences.
Can I just say, for me, this is the sin of empire, because of course, if you know about things about empire, and I live in the capital of what was for a very long time, or for a certain amount of time, the world's biggest empire, the
Yes.
biggest empire the world has ever known. You know that the rewards of empire go to the very few, and the burdens of empire are borne by the great many. This is within your own home country. It actually
Yes.
creates polarization. It ultimately creates corruption and inequality. And that's what we're seeing in the United States. What the United States needs to do, I've said this many times, I'm repeating myself now, is it needs to get away from the empire, which after all, it started as an anti-imperial enterprise. Broke away from Britain. It
Yeah.
needs to go back to that and rediscover itself as the republic, that very imperfect, flawed, all kinds of problems it had, but nonetheless, it was much closer to the ideals of what it was meant to be. This is absolutely my view, and I hope it doesn't come traumatically. I hope it can come internally. But listening to what you tell us, Larry, it seems to me very, very far gone. And one does wonder whether it can be changed and turned round.
Yeah, unfortunately, history shows us that it's only in moments of crisis that
Yeah.
you can get such changes. I
Mm.
really sort of hope that the events of 9/11 in 2001 would have provided, that was an opportunity that could have really changed the focus of the United States. I mean, at that time, if you think back, you had Russia and Syria offering to work with the United States in dealing with the problem of, there was a legitimate problem with some radical Islamic violence. On the other hand, the United States and the West needed to take some responsibility for having helped provoke that. The influence of the West, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia, did produce a pushback. So it has to be sort of a two-way street in that understanding. But instead of that, we went off on, let's invade Iraq again. And, it really, when you start looking at the litany of interventions, because under Obama, it started with the Arab Spring, the interventions in Libya, and then the intervention in Syria to attempt to overthrow Bashar Assad, followed then by the intervention with the Maidan in Ukraine. And then, we can add to that places like Kazakhstan attempts and attempts in Belarus. So the United States it's out of control. It is out of control with respect to trying to overthrow and change foreign governments, and all the time hollering in the most extreme voice about the outrage of foreign interference in our elections, when, by God, that's all we've been doing over the last 20 years.
Absolutely. And I think, to be frank, I think Ukraine is both the logical result of all of this pattern of interventions, and it could very well be its endpoint, because I think a debacle in Ukraine, and it's important to look at the map, see where Ukraine is. It adjoins Europe. It's part of Europe. If there's a colossal failure there, it's not like Iraq, it's not like Afghanistan, it's not like Libya, faraway places about which we know little, to misquote Neville Chamberlain. This is a place ultimately very close to us in Europe. And what you said before, that this could create a crisis within NATO, It has every potential to do that. And I do wonder again whether people in Washington understand this.
Well, plus, look at what's going through economically in the UK. I hear it's equally bad in Germany and in France. And the news media is not covering it. They just ignore it. Maybe it will go away. But I can't see that engendering great support among the population for the current governments and saying, oh, yeah, we'll back them to the hilt. And particularly when we're sending, billions, literally billions of dollars in aid and weapons to Ukraine, and they're losing.
Well, Larry, I think this is because I've been talking for quite a long time. I think this is, I really should bring in Alex, and I was wondering whether Alex wanted to add things whilst we have you with us.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions, and I'll get to those questions. We'll try to get as many questions as we can in the next, say, 15, 20 minutes. But Larry, I have to ask you about your piece on the salt mines.
Yeah.
Soledar. And what can you relay to our viewers with regards to those salt mines and what you know about them?
Well, I didn't know anything about them until the Biden White House started talking about them. I mean, wait a second. Why are you bringing that up? And I mean, their argument was that Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, I guess in his previous life, he was a chef. So clearly, he had to get some extra salt to, properly spice the food he's cooking. So, I mean, that was the level of nonsense. And I thought, let's look at this. And then when you get into it and find out these salt mines, 125 miles of passages underground, work that out, or what is that, 150 kilometers? So 160 kilometers? That's enormous. And that the areas carved out inside they could host sporting events and concerts and other things. So that then raises the question, what's being stored down there? Now, I'm sure from its previous history and intelligence files, I'm sure that there were military equipment and supplies stored in those salt mines as a way that in the event of a nuclear war, you'd at least have a place where you could survive. Well, there are other possibilities as well, as I brought up, I think, earlier, that you could have some of the old nuclear weapons that the Russians had that Ukraine was supposed to give up and maybe didn't, kept it there, or the products from biological experiments for bioweapons. So, and this goes back, I remember both of you have commented in the past that you were scratching your heads trying to figure out why were they fighting so fiercely to salvage Bakhmut and Soledar, and I mean literally churning up tens of thousands of their military personnel, and otherwise it didn't appear to be that strategically important. But once you factor in the salt mines, you realize I think that was the key to the area. There's something that I think there'll be some revelations out of that in the coming weeks.
Right. Fantastic. All right. Larry, let's see here. We have some questions. Let's try to get to as many questions as we can. Whatever questions we can address, we will answer them in a dedicated video as well. But let's begin with Ricardo Alfonso. Propaganda has its uses, but when it becomes incongruent with the facts on the ground, then you will lose your public's support. No one will believe you. How do you recover from that? Ukrainians are realizing this very quickly.
No, you don't recover overnight. You're losing your credibility. Actually, the key to effective propaganda is it does have to be based in some element of truth. And what is happening now with respect to Ukraine is we're into Baghdad Bob territory, where there are no tanks in Baghdad, and you see the pictures in the bank as the tanks come rolling down the main boulevard. The West is in the same position. So it's that old fable of the boy who cried wolf. Once you lose that credibility, then nobody believes you anymore, and there may come a time when they need to believe you, but nobody will. So it's disastrous from a political standpoint for the West to have engaged in this.
All right. Fender Strat, thank you for that amazing super chat. Thanks for your wonderful current affairs programming, something I've missed for so long. I appreciate the hard work you all do. Perhaps in 2023, you can try and explain the UK-Japan chicanery and Indochina in general.
Well, I was sort of it's funny what a difference 80 years makes, huh? So, it's 79 years ago. The UK and the Japanese were not exactly on the friendliest of terms, and the Japanese had done some pretty heinous things to British prisoners. The bridge over the River Kwai, but it really seems sort of a desperate move, because Britain doesn't have anything to offer militarily. I mean, they really don't. They don't have a significant troop level. They don't have significant naval presence. In fact, I think the last time they tried to get their aircraft carrier out of port, it broke down going out. So, why align yourself with weakness? I don't get that.
Commander Crossfire, are we starting to see infighting or divisions in Russia that could compromise the military campaign or public cohesion?
I haven't seen it. It's wishful Western thinking that would happen. I don't want to come across as if presenting that, Russia's done everything perfectly and there have been no disagreements and they haven't rethought some things along the way. But I am impressed by the tranquility, honesty of you can tell a politician when they're lying. It's not just that their lips are moving. You get to compare what they say with the reality of what you see on the ground. It's been remarkable. You long to have a politician like that in the West. We said, we made mistakes in the past that, we trusted these guys and we shouldn't trust them. So I see it's the Western illusion or delusion that there's going to rise up and get rid of Putin. No, it's just the West has this common theme. If we just get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, Bashar Assad, if we just get rid of them, everything will be great. And they get rid of them, and then what happens? Well, actually things go to worse, from bad to worse.
Right. A follow-up to that question, once again from Commando Crossfire, and actually goes into what you just said, Larry. What are the Russians' weak or vulnerable points in Ukraine in their operation? They aren't invincible. Is there a move that could undercut their advance?
I don't see it. It would, if Ukraine had sufficient ground force. So let's say that they had the same number of troops, trained troops, and they had air operations, effective air operations, then yes, I think they could stop the Russians at some point, or force the Russians to have to engage in a much more bloody battle, because the Russians would not have the advantage. But all Ukraine has is the operations, and they're backed up with U.S. intelligence and backed up with UK NATO intelligence. So they don't have effective air operations, and they don't have effective cruise missiles. So they have limited ability to strike.
Can I just add quickly, because there's been lots of discussions about problems within Russia, and this is something which, by the way, doesn't get picked up. The Russians, and at the very highest level, Putin himself, have admitted that they went into the war with both underestimating the value of drones and with far too few drones. And there's been a lot of talk about this, about getting production of drones organized. They've been buying them from Iran. They've set up a committee headed by a deputy prime minister, a man called Belousov, to try to solve this problem of the shortage of drones. So they do recognize a problem there. And if you, by the way, follow Russian commentaries, and apparently this is now happening within the military, there's also a widespread view that Russia has too little infantry, that Russian military units are over armored, and that you need more people, more actual, people with rifles and things like that to cover the flanks. So, I mean, these are just two things. There's been lots of discussions about many problems in Russia, but the biggest one, the biggest single source of concern has been drones. The fact that they don't have enough of them. Not ammunition, not artillery, not tanks. They're not running out of cruise missiles. They have been talking about a major shortage of drones.
Hey, can I ask you guys one thing? Because I had observed, the focus right now on the Wagner Group. And again, the United States tries to disparage that, play it down as a gang of convicts, ignoring the fact that The Dirty Dozen was a great movie that everybody celebrated with James Brown, Jim Brown, the running back. When Russia took Mariupol, Chechen played a major role in that, and they were filling the Telegram channels with videos and images of that. They've disappeared, and yet they've got a sizable force and a very well trained force, and I haven't seen them really anywhere on social media. Have you?
Well, can I just again come back to that, Larry, because I've commented on that very fact that you made that point in my latest video, which hasn't yet appeared. I think you're absolutely correct. I think the Russians are holding them back. They're obviously an extremely effective unit. They're probably being earmarked for some purpose. The fact that they've disappeared from the scene, even though Kadyrov, their leader, says there's 9,000 of them, which is a sizable group of people, trained fighters there. Well, that shows that something big is coming. It's another reason to think that something big is coming. So I think you're absolutely right about that as well. And no doubt at some point we will be seeing them doing something in the very near future. But what it is, I'm not even going to try to guess.
Well, I just like to observe that as I watch the operations. Again, there are limited video clips, but when you watch how the Chechen the Wagnerians operate. They operate in a very professional manner. They're not walking around like a bunch of cowboys, just out to shoot things up. They have a level of discipline that you'd hope to see in any military force.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was saying this in my morning video, Larry Alexander, is that in Soledar, it was, if I'm not mistaken, 100% the Wagner guys.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and they went up from another thing that I've understood is that they went up against some very elite Ukraine forces in Soledar.
Yeah.
That should be very worrying for Ukraine and NATO to see that.
Yeah, this is absolutely correct. That's entirely correct. It was apparently a unit that received, or at least the soldiers in the unit received training in Britain. It didn't do them much good, it turns out. But no, the Wagner Group is a very interesting organization. It has emerged over the last few years. There's lots of discussion about it. There's lots of discussion about Prigozhin's role. There's uncertainty about its exact size. Apparently, there's some rumors that it's gone up from 5,000 men a few years ago, that there's now about 50,000 men involved in it. This is a big force, and it's playing a very big role in this war, and it's playing a very big role in Russian outreach in places like West Africa and in other places, and in Syria too, by the way. And my own personal view is that at some level the Russian authorities, the professional military are involved as well in it. And bear in mind that all those prisoners that are joining the Wagner Group, and apparently this is not a problem. They're having a lot of opportunity to recruit young men from the prisons, and they're able to get in, they're able to get pardons, and let's be shocked by this. The French Foreign Legion has been doing this ever since it was first created, and nobody's found that at all remarkable or strange. But anyway, the fact that they're able to do that, well, Prigozhin can't give people pardons. Only Putin can. So, because he's the president. So if these people are getting pardons in that way, it must mean that the Russian state authorities are involved in this organization in some way. I think if I was in the US intelligence community, which I'm not, obviously, I think I would be paying a great deal of attention to the Wagner organization and asking myself, what is this thing? What is it going to be doing in the future? Are we looking at something that has a permanent place within the Russian military order of things, and what is it all about, and what's its structure, what's its organization, who trains it, who equips it? It operates jet bombers. I mean, Sukhoi 24 bombers, for example, Sukhoi 25, ground attack aircraft. So this is clearly a significant force that's been built up, and my own sense is that the Russian authorities fully control it and control what it does. And you're absolutely right, Alex. It was the only unit that was involved in storming Solidar.
You can see Irina's comment down below. How is it possible that ex-cons from Voronezh pushed NATO-trained and well-equipped, in quotes, Ukrainians from Solidar?
Well, there you go. I mean, clearly these ex-cons have received a very high level of training. And of course, we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that everybody who serves in the Wagner organization is, from prisons. They come from lots of different parts of Russian life. I mean, if you spend any time in contact with Russians, I mean, the amount of military knowledge and expertise and backgrounds in Russia is just huge. I mean, so many Russians have passed through the military, and that's obviously, it's drawing on that to a great extent.
Yeah, remember that what happens in the West is the Wagner Group is presented as a bunch of deranged psychopaths, and that's ridiculous. That even in the United States military, in the past, if somebody who was 17 or 18 ran afoul of the law, they were sometimes given the choice of, instead of going to prison, joining the Marine Corps, or joining the Army. So we did it too. It's just the hypocrisy of it is what irritates me.
Yeah. Real quick, Larry, what would you say are the differences between, say, something like Wagner in Russia and something in the US like Academy, I think is what they're called. Yeah. Blackwater, then became Academy. The Prince, his outfit. What do you think are the key differences there?
The key difference is that it looks to me like the guys in the Wagner Group are younger and in better condition. A lot of times what happens with groups like Academy and Blackwater or Triple Canopy, whole group of them, usually get guys that were retired and when in the process of being retired actually had some physical disabilities, loss or other things that would disqualify them if they continued in the regular Army. So, it's times people that are they could never make special operations in the real military, and they see this as their chance to live that sort of fantasy. But just observing what I've seen with the Wagnerians, they appear to have pretty good fire control. You can just tell if they're running down the street with a rifle, do they finger the trigger or off the trigger? Little things like that. Or when they've got other soldiers around them, what's the muzzle discipline? Are they muzzle flashing the gun at one of their colleagues? I mean, even when you're in combat, you've got to be aware that you don't want to point the end of your firearm at one of your buddies. The end of that firearm is only what you intend to kill or destroy.
Right. You have time for a couple more questions, Larry?
Yeah.
We'll wrap it up.
Larry? Couple more questions?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's do a couple more. We'll wrap it up. All right. Great. Sanjeva says Russian indecisiveness in the beginning of the SMO, counting on the rationality of the West, did cost significantly for Russia. I was told that there were still some in Moscow who failed to realize that the West has maximalist ambitions.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I also think that those illusions have now finally gone, which comes back to the point that Larry was making earlier in the program. By the way, that is a criticism that's often made of me, that I always overestimate the rationality of people, and I've made that mistake many times, and I've no doubt at all that the Russians have made it in the past, but I don't think they have any doubts any longer that, you know, they're not dealing with, as Larry was saying, people you can really work with.
Now, I mean, what I find amusing is
Mm.
Putin is the voice of moderation compared to someone like Medvedev right now. And in the
Mm.
past, Medvedev was always seen as, oh yeah, he's the preferable option in the West.
Mm.
No, not anymore. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Nina Z says Merrick Garland just appointed special counsel into the Biden docs. Look at that.
I think the exit strategy for Biden is being planned. Not that Kamala Harris has any great shakes to take over, but I think they realize now, with the Republicans in charge, House representatives, they're in a position to subpoena, get documents, and get witnesses. They've got at least 12, and I'm told as many as 20 current FBI agents that have come out as whistleblowers that are just chomping at the bit to testify about the political influence. So the cover that Biden has had up to this point is disappearing. And so I think they recognize there's some liabilities. And it goes back to what I said earlier. When they lose Ukraine, hey, he's on a losing track record. He's lost Afghanistan, he's lost Ukraine. What next?
Can I just take this opportunity to say that I agree with you, both gentlemen, on this? I think you're absolutely correct. I think this is a sign that, you know, the ground is shifting under Biden's feet. I don't believe this information has come out by chance. I mean, these papers have been lying around in all kinds of places. It is inconceivable that this has only just been discovered now. And of course, what has happened is that somebody has said, well, Biden made all those statements about Trump and, you know, classified documents. Merrick Garland appointed special counsel. Garland really had no choice. I mean, he was already being criticized for, you know, looking ridiculous by not appointing special counsel, and he had to do it. So he's done it, but it's clearly something that somebody has been preparing and has launched at this time with, I'm sure, the kind of purpose that you've been saying.
Now, we still don't have a good explanation how they discovered these, because you know, if you've got something stored, you know, think about the documents you've got stored around your house. You got a reason to go in there and start looking for them. Either you're going to throw them out or you're going to move to someplace. And this apparently got kicked off before the election. So they, you know, again, I think there are some people, particularly within the FBI, aware of this, leaking or back channeling this information as whistleblowers to some members of Congress. That may be one of the other dynamics at play here.
Yeah. I mean, I would just quickly add also that these documents are in multiple places. How do people know where to look? I mean, it's clearly something, you know, I mean, anyway.
Lawyers cleaning out the closet.
You got to wonder about what the particular class of, because they're reportedly a top secret SCI, which means special compartmented information. So I can't imagine him taking anything that was NSA material from the National Security Agency, because those transcripts and intercepts are generally pretty boring, you know. And I've never really seen anything that I would think about taking and say, oh, I got to keep this. This is going to be good. Possibly a CIA human report, except those kinds of reports have become fewer and farther between. I think what you're looking at is it was a report or analysis or something that he may have tasked. He actually could have tasked somebody for give me the rundown layout of the criminal organizations in Ukraine and who controls what, something along that line, or what's about power structure. So it would be an analytical piece that used special, highly classified intelligence in order to produce it. I think that's the kind of his possession.
Yeah. Final question then, since we're talking about the Biden docs, from Ruben. Deep State is trying to pressure Biden to do something he doesn't want to do in Ukraine, perhaps boots on the ground or a false flag.
Well, if I got to be careful how I answer this, because I don't want to come across that I hope the only good that could come of that is if the United States would do it. It would be such a disaster for the United States that it might force us into that intervention to get us help to stop doing this stupid stuff. That if the deep state is that desperate and dumb to try to move in that to escalate in that way, it's going to blow up. Just as it did in Iraq, just as it did in Afghanistan. The definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome, and they're not getting it.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, those docs, I'm telling you. Anyway. Oh boy, we started 2023 off in a very interesting way, haven't we, gentlemen?
Indeed. Indeed, we certainly have. Can I just answer one quick question? Because I saw there was a question from somebody, I think called Stephen Mann, who I think has written to me asking the same question about which was the treaty which prevented the Americans and the Russians putting weapons within, close to each other's borders. I'm sure you're referring to the the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, the INF Treaty. Just say, because I haven't responded in writing, so I've seen the email, the question here, so I'm just replying now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. I heard that the locals chat is down, so I apologize for that. I'm going to follow it up with locals and see what's going on there. So I do apologize if that chat went down midstream. Let's wrap it up here. The great Larry Johnson, sonar21.com. The link to Larry's publication, all his articles, fantastic analysis is in the description box down below, and I will add it as a linked comment as well once we end this stream. Larry, thank you very, very much for joining us on this live stream. It was fantastic.
I'm honored to be with you guys. Always appreciate the chance.
Alexander Mercouris in London, brilliant as always. To our moderators, thank you very, very much for everything that you do. We appreciate it so much, and we appreciate everybody who joined us on this live stream, watching us on Rockfin, the Rockfin chat. Thank you very, very much. Gioha, thank you for that tip. Thank you very much for that. Everybody on Odyssey, thank you so much. And Rumble, click that like on Rumble. Rumble now has likes, everybody, down below instead of pluses. They've gotten a new redesign, and it's fantastic. So thank you, everybody at Rumble, and everybody that was watching on the locals chat. Thank you very, very much. Everybody on Telegram as well, thank you for watching. Any final thoughts, Larry and Alexander, and we'll sign out. Any final thoughts or comments?
Well, I think this has been an amazing chat. That's all I'm going to say, because we've covered so much ground, but we've learned so much.
I pray for peace, because there's a lot of killing that needs to stop in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's a good way to end this. Take care, everybody. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.